Craft matters. In small ways, like how a coffee is brewed. And in not so small ways, like how your money is cared for. Which is why for 160 years, UBS has elevated banking to a craft. Tailoring unique strategies that combine human expertise with the latest technologies. All happening across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs. With you at the heart of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 8th of October 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, is France heading for fresh elections, with the far right refusing to engage in crisis talks aimed at breaking the political deadlock and calls growing for Emmanuel Macron to step down? Nina Dos Santos will join me in the studio, bringing us the latest. Also coming up in the next 60 minutes.
If I had been sitting there, I would be thinking, okay, I'm hoping that most of these things I'm hearing are not actually going to happen. But I would also be thinking, how will I convey this to my troops?
It's a week since Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth addressed US's military top brass. We will hear from the former commanding general of the US Army in Europe about the new realities facing American generals today. We'll examine why Argentina's President Javier Milei is reviving his rock star image to try to woo back his electorate, and
this year's prize is about encountering quantum mechanics on a new scale.
The Nobel Prize for Physics explained, plus the papers and the tech news too. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in the news today. The US National Guard troops from Texas have arrived in Chicago to support President Trump's immigration crackdown. Italy's Prime Minister says she and two others have been referred to the International Criminal Court for alleged complicity in genocide in connection with Israel's offensive in Gaza. And the Ecuadorian President Daniel Noboa is reportedly safe after his motorcade was attacked by 500 people. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, how close is France to a major political upheaval? Without a prime minister and with the far right refusing to commit to talks on breaking the political deadlock, there seems a growing likelihood that snap parliamentary elections could be on the cards. Added to this, a louder and louder calls for the president himself to step aside. So to try to make sense of what has just happened and what indeed may happen, Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent, former CNN Europe editor. A very good morning to you, Nina.
Hi, Emma.
Good to have you with us. Right, so it's 2 days since Le Cornu, the Prime Minister, left. Where are we?
Well, Emmanuel Macron hasn't yet decided what to do from here on. He's been taking soundings from the leaders of the two houses of Parliament, the Assemblée Nationale, the lower house, and also the Senate. And in the meantime, his outgoing Prime Minister, Sébastien Lecornu, has been continuing the dialogue with those warring parties on the left and the right inside this increasingly unruly parliamentary setup that France has been left with over the last year, one that increasingly is becoming ungovernable. In the meantime, what we've had is the clearest hint yet that France may be heading towards parliamentary elections, possibly next month, because local officials have been told to prepare for potential elections on the 16th of November and a second round thereafter on the 23rd of November. So we're talking here about legislative elections that wouldn't threaten Emmanuel Macron's presidency, which runs until 2027. However, that said, parties on the left and the right are paying for his political blood, and already two of his own former prime ministers have now turned against him and questioned the merits of staying on in the Élysée for his full term.
Yeah, so everything is pointing towards one thing, which is a parliamentary election that you've just mentioned. The fact remains, though, that were he to go to the country, the likelihood is what? He would lose, or his party would lose.
Well, this is going to be really potentially quite embarrassing for Emmanuel Macron. Remember that he called these snap elections just over a year or so ago to try and neuter the far right, which was rising in the insurgency. This is the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's far right party led by Jordan Bardella. And he didn't succeed in preventing their rise. What he did was he managed to encourage the rise of both the far left and the far right and essentially split the political setup in France in three ways, hence the reason why we've got these political impasses over the last year, because those three factions can't agree. And his movement is in the centre. The polls currently indicate that if France were to go to the elections today, the Rassemblement National, the far right, would get 32% of the vote, so it could come out even more resurgent than before. And then you'd have the leftist parties taking another 25%. Macron would be in third position with 15%, and then you'd have sort of the rest of it being Les Républicains, the once famous Gaullist party that used to dominate French politics and gave the country the likes of Jacques Chirac and, people like Nicolas Sarkozy from the right. But they blame Emmanuel Macron very heavily for having torpedoed the chances of the moderate parties on both the left and right with his centrist movement. And the big question for him now is he bringing France to the precipice of its most dangerous and unruly moment in the history of the Fifth Republic since 1958?
And we're looking at those who are his allies, as you have said, are deserting Macron now. But we're also seeing, I'm just looking at the front page of Le Parisien this morning, and it's saying that time is running out. There's only a few hours to find a compromise on this incredibly controversial budget. And we've got the former Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne saying, let's suspend the reform of retirement of pensions in France, which is always the thing that breaks every government that tries to have a go at this. No government has managed to properly, radically and fundamentally reform French pensions. But the fact that we've got Elizabeth Borne speaking now, how effective will something that so last minute be? Will it save the day?
So what Elizabeth Borne is suggesting here is, remember, she tried to push through that very controversial pension reform to raise the retirement age. It drew huge amounts of people to the streets. There were big protests. She's saying, well, look, let's just suspend that, offer that up as an olive branch to the left as one of the concessions for the moment to try and get them on board to support a future government, because France hasn't been able to pass a budget for the last year. And the problem is that this is a country with debt levels of 114%, 113% of its GDP, and a deficit of about 5.4%, which is heading on for double the EU's own limit. There's real concerns that France, if it faces a rout in the bond markets, the stock markets have already been extremely turbulent over the last few months as a result. It's costing the country dear. She says, more or less, let's repeal this for the moment to try and get one side on board and then pass some kind of a budget. But many analysts fear that France won't have a fresh budget until at least the end of this year. And that would mean, obviously, that before now and then we'd see some kind of parliamentary elections or increased pressure on Emmanuel Macron himself to resign. Now, let's talk about the presidency, the executive presidency. Of course, the irony of France is that it's been a very stable government since 1958 when the Fifth Republic was announced. And, you have an executive presidency that lasts quite a long time. Macron doesn't technically need to resign before early 2027 when his time is up. And he's repeatedly said he wouldn't. But we've now had two of his own former prime ministers, Edouard Philippe and also Gabriel Attal, coming out saying, look, he really shouldn't hold on to the Élysée longer than necessary. He should start to pave the way for an orderly transition so there can be elections in 2026 and leave early, because he's bringing France to the economic and political brink.
Indeed, I think I read somewhere that this whole political crisis is costing the French economy 0.5% of GDP. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. But looking at Emmanuel Macron as not necessarily a leader who likes to concede defeat. I mean, going to the country last year was a sort of a fighting gesture, which ultimately led to where we probably are sitting here today. But the fact remains is that despite the fact that this is probably for the first time the serious calls for him to step aside, what is the likelihood of him doing that?
It is still looking pretty unlikely because he's repeatedly refused that suggestion. By the way, there's not just pressure for him to step aside, there's also pressure for him to be de facto impeached, coming from Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's tabled a motion that's backed by 104 of his MPs. So the concept of potentially seeing a French president de facto ousted from office is one that presumably would alarm a lot of French people, as I was saying before, and also international investors who recognise that there's a lot at stake here. This is the second biggest economy inside the Eurozone. If France were to need some kind of international bailouts, the ECB presumably would be first, run, by the way, by a French woman, Christine Lagarde, who was once mooted as a potential future French president. She's come out in the last few days saying, guys, rule me out. The job is utterly toxic. I do not want it. But it is a big question mark for France, where it goes from here, because they've had such a Jupiterian president, they say, that people are becoming increasingly disaffected with the French political class. There was a poll showing that 86% of French people are utterly appalled by what they're seeing happening in Paris at the moment. And
the fact remains is, if you have someone like Christine Lagarde ruling herself out of the race, the question does, but you do have to ask the question, who could possibly, or how would they replace the president?
Well, as I said before, there's this motion that Mélenchon has tabled with his allies that essentially would, it's not entirely, it's called something else rather than an impeachment motion, but it would essentially turf Macron out of office. It's not really happened before. It's a long shot, but what it does is it again continues to sully his reputation, I suppose, and his legacy. And Macron, as we know, is very focused on his legacy. We've seen him invest a lot of time recently on the international stage with his sort of big picture thinking, trying to solve problems around the world, lecturing other countries about how to defend Europe, how to reposition Europe against the United States now that the US has sort of abandoned the security of the European continent in the future. But that's not going down very well with French people and French politicians, because they already think that Emmanuel Macron sort of checked out of the job and is looking on to another big role internationally. And I suspect that come a few years from now, he may well be viewed as the president that was quite detached and sort of abandoned France and created this situation where it had actually spent a huge amount of money and then eventually couldn't rein in that spending. Lots of his pro-business legacy may well end up being repealed by any socialist and left-wing government that comes in. And remember, even if the far right comes in, not only are they quite anti-immigrant, they're also quite economically protectionist. And protectionism is an economic order of the day across both sides of the Atlantic these days.
Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent, former CNN Europe editor. Thank you for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist. It's a week now since the US President Donald Trump and his Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth hauled in their US generals from around the world to tell them to up their physical game and to be more warlike. Back at their bases, these generals now have the job of communicating Washington's directives to their own troops. Well, Monocle's Chris Chermak heard from General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of the US Army in Europe, about the new realities facing American generals today and what it will really take to modernise our militaries. Chris began by asking whether General Hodges had ever himself attended such a meeting as the one that took place last week.
Never. No, not at all. When I was a cadet at West Point, starting back in the summer of '76, of course, this was right on the heels of Vietnam. And so we had a lot of instruction about leadership and about rules of engagement and war crimes. This was right after the My Lai incident. So this was pounded into our head about lawful orders, the Constitution, that sort of thing. But there was never a time where I thought there was a threat to the Constitution or a pressure on the military to do something that was at odds with our oath to the Constitution. And I think, as you know, Chris, we emphasize it over and over and over. The oath is to the Constitution. And the expectation that nobody obeys an unlawful order. You only obey lawful orders, and you have a responsibility to be able to tell the difference. So I've never seen anything like what we're seeing now. Now, of course, there are always commanders' conferences where leaders get called back to D.C. or maybe to, wherever the regional headquarters are located. But that would not be everybody. For the years we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, there would be weekly secure calls that were done remotely to talk about updates and classified information, that sort of thing. I've never seen it where everybody was called back. It would have seemed preposterous any other time.
It has now been a week since this presentation of sorts by Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump. What do you think has been going through generals' minds?
Well, let me say, first of all, I was very proud when I saw the pictures of those women and men, the generals, the admirals, and the top sergeants, the top non-commissioned officers, sergeants major, sitting there, respectful, professional, and completely silent. That's exactly what it should have been. This was not a political rally. So I was very proud. And I think American people and our allies should take some confidence from that. I would imagine if I had been sitting there, I would be thinking, okay, I'm hoping that most of these things I'm hearing are not actually going to happen. But I would also be thinking, how will I convey this to my troops? And also, how will I convey this to my allies? As commander of U.S. Army in Europe, my British and French and German and Polish and Finnish and Romanian counterparts would be saying, hey, what the hell is that about? And I would have to find a way to be loyal and respectful and explain what I thought these policies might mean. And for an ally, concerns about rules of engagement, for example, that would have impact on allies.
Absolutely would. And I wanted to get to Europe in a moment, but also just the aspects of what the Secretary of Defense, or of War as now it's being called, Pete Hegseth, focused on, this developing the idea of the warrior mentality, physical attributes, the fitness of the generals. I'm curious from your perspective, again, if you had been sitting there, where do you think the U.S. military, and frankly with its European allies for that matter, needs to actually modernize?
Look, it is the prerogative of every leader to lay out priorities, expectations. That's completely normal stuff. There is a place to talk about standards. And of course, for all kinds of obvious reasons, being fit is an important part of that. What I didn't like was the emphasis on male standards. And the underlying tone was pure misogyny to try and weed out as many females as possible. That, number one, that's not a wise policy because we don't have enough men between the ages of 18 and 25 who can meet all the standards to enter the armed forces to meet all our requirements. So there's a demographic need to attract and recruit females who want to serve. Secondly, we have matured a lot in the last several decades about standards. A person that's going to be a Navy SEAL or an infantry machine gunner and somebody who's going to be an intelligence officer have different physical requirements. And so I think we've been smart in getting requirements for our physical standards that are relevant to the job. And if you've got a woman that can do everything required to be a Navy SEAL or a Ranger or whatever, do it. I tell you what, I could not be a pilot. I would have never survived flying in a high-performance aircraft. I couldn't do that. So I just think his emphasis on push-ups and that sort of thing is below and not relevant to his duties as Secretary of Defense.
Just finally, General Hodges, you talked about the dilemma that you would face if you had to now come back to explain what happened last week to your European allies. And beyond that, more broadly, I'm curious, whether it's rules of engagement or other aspects of this, are we seeing Europe and the US kind of take separate tracks at this point, particularly given the Trump administration, but also with the challenges that Europe is facing? It doesn't currently sound like we're talking about the West standing on its own 2 feet. We're talking about each continent learning to rely on itself.
Yeah, I do have that same sort of sensing, Chris, that there is a divergence at some levels, not everywhere. You can be sure that right down the road in Wiesbaden at the headquarters of U.S. Army Europe and Africa, they are 100% focused on working with our European allies. There's no daylight there. But back in D.C., perhaps, or in other places, there is some divergence. And the rules of engagement is perhaps a symptom of that. Now, I was very concerned when I listened to what the Secretary of Defense was saying about no more stupid rules of engagement, as if these are some kind of, and even used the phrase politically correctness and somehow linked rules of engagement to being woke. That makes no sense. Anybody that has really been involved in combat or conducted operations understands that the rules of engagement are what helps keep us in compliance with the Geneva Conventions. It's a legal framework for conducting lethal operations. And frankly, we've never won a war and we're never going to win a war by killing everybody in sight. But that's how he talked about it. I mean, frankly, what he described is exactly what the Russian army is. They can do a bunch of push-ups. They have no rules of engagement. They have no respect for civilian life, and they kill everything that gets in front of them. That's not who we want to be. That's not how soldiers from a democratic country are supposed to fight. Same with discipline. You know, he said, you can put your hands on trainees again. When was that ever a good thing? That's not who we are. And that's not the kind of soldier that we want to produce. We want to produce women and men who are fit, who are disciplined, who understand how to fight and how to take care of their equipment and how to be a member of a team. So what I heard from him was a series of things that were going to have a very corrosive effect. I don't think that's who we are. That's not who soldiers in the British Army are. That's not who we want to be. And I hope that our senior military leadership and also the Congress help stop that kind of dangerous tendency.
General Ben Hodges there, speaking to Monocle's Chris Chermak. Still to come on today's programme. Now that is the sound of Argentina's President Javier Milei on stage this week. He's promoting his new book. Find out more a little bit later on The Globalist.
Craft is a matter of perspective, a unique outlook, an obsessive attention to detail. With UBS's Chief Investment Office Houseview, we're focused on identifying the latest investment opportunities and market risks to help you achieve your financial goals. So you get the big picture broken down into thought-provoking insights. Delivered daily and curated by over 200 globally connected, locally active analysts. UBS. Banking is our craft.
7:22 here in London. Now let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio, Phil Clark, Professor of International Politics at SOAS University of London. Good morning, Phil.
Good morning, Emma.
You're not often here anymore, so this is a little special thing, isn't it?
Delightful to be back.
It's good. So you don't live here anymore?
I don't. I'm mostly in Cape Town these days, but I come back and teach for this chunk of the year in London. So, yeah, delighted to be here.
I am very glad that you actually come back and teach face-to-face, because there's nothing worse than an online course.
Oh, it's woeful. No. Virtual teaching, terrible for the teachers, even worse for the students.
Absolutely. So we wish you all the best with this term and whatever. You've brought he's brought one A4 paper in, ladies and gentlemen, but it's crammed with words, and this is the paper review. So how we're going to refer to newspapers without actually having papers in front of us is anyone's guess, but we'll have a go. Let's have a look at The Guardian. I think we do need to talk, as a matter of importance, about this meeting, this love-in between Donald Trump and Mark Carney yesterday. I mean, Mark Carney is in trouble, both in terms of the way that he approaches what is a very, very problematic neighbour.
This is a very tricky meeting, and Carney seemed geared up for it. He knew he was walking into a very difficult negotiation with Donald Trump. Trump, of course, has said terrible things about Canada and about Carney in the past, and has threatened to make Canada the 51st state of the US. Has called Carney a kind of a weak and dithering leader, but Carney's there to do a deal. I mean, Canada is the only G7 country that doesn't yet have a trade deal with the US. Carney has to absorb the the blows from Trump, but also has been trying to schmooze him and trying to get a decent deal for his country. So, yeah, a very tricky tightrope that Carney's been walking in the last day or so.
And Carney was doing the smoothing of the words, wasn't he? Because at one point, I think Trump said, we want Canada to do great. We have natural conflict. We also have mutual love, which, I mean, hearing the words mutual love coming out of Donald Trump's mouth is something quite astonishing. But to have natural conflict, this is something that Carney picked up on, is it? And said, there are areas where we compete. So he's doing absolutely everything, even to his choice of verbs, to make sure that things look good.
Exactly. Carney has to defend the sovereignty of Canada. He's embattled at home, and there was a real worry in Canada that he would basically cave in to Trump and that Canada would end up with a very bad deal. So Carney clearly has a domestic constituency that he has to keep on board, but he has this very tricky US president that he has to extract a deal from. And so at the level of language, Carney was being very clever and I think very agile. Carney also did a fair bit of schmoozing here. He said to Trump that he was wearing a red tie and that he respected the US, but nevertheless was saying these tariffs that the US has imposed on Canada over the last few months are hugely damaging to the Canadian economy. Trump has said that these 35% tariffs that the US imposed on Canada back in August are justified because of the enormous amount of fentanyl that is being trafficked across the border from Canada to the US. And Carney actually addressed the fentanyl issue in the negotiations yesterday. So Carney really is doing his utmost, I think, to try to talk to Trump on his own terms, even though you get a sense that this is really not what Carney would like to have to do.
No. OK. Let's move on to Madagascar. There's some news coming out of there from the Reuters website. The president is planning to hold a national dialogue. I think we have to go back a couple of days. We've got huge protests from young people on the streets in Madagascar who've issued a 48-hour ultimatum for him to agree to their demands or for everyone to go on strike. I mean, it seems as if the protesters have the upper hand here.
Indeed. It's mostly youth protesters, and they've brought the Madagascar capital, Antananarivo, completely to a standstill and are threatening this national strike. And we're seeing some really strong reaction from President Rajoelina, who now has called this national dialogue today, seems to be making a few concessions to the protesters. Much of the foreign press, Reuters, France 24 and others, are labelling these as Gen Z protests. I think they're trying to make a link to what's going on in places like Kenya and Nepal, obviously the latter where we've seen the government recently toppled. I always think that kind of label is slightly misleading. It gives a sense that there's some commonality across all of these places. I don't see anything really in the Madagascar protests that suggests that they're gaining inspiration or even invoking these protests in other parts of the world. This is a very localized issue, and it's been brewing for a while. It's not the first time recently that we've seen student-led protests in Madagascar. There was a wave last year too. They're particularly complaining about the massive levels of youth unemployment, which is a huge issue across many African states at the moment, and also constant cuts to electricity and water. So actually the demands are very specific, very localized. It's the kind of thing that many young people across the continent are worried about. And so this Gen Z label is perhaps a little bit misleading in trying to connect the dots between different parts of the world and different very disparate protests around the world.
Let's have a lovely story, finally, from the Irish Times. We don't mention the Irish Times very much. We should do more. It's good. Nobel Committee unable to reach prize winner on digital detox hiking holiday. We have a lovely gentleman called Fred Ramsdell, who should know at the moment that he's just won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. If you're listening, Fred, well done. Congratulations. Thank you for tuning in to Monocle Radio. As far as we know, though, he's switched everything off.
I have to say, Fred Ramsdell's had a much better performance when switching his phone back on than I usually have. If I've been out on a big night, I usually find 27 missed calls from my wife trying to work out where I am. And in the case of Fred Ramsdell, who was on a 3-week hike, what he's called a digital detox in Idaho, Wyoming and Montana. Actually, it was his wife who switched her phone on to discover 1,000 messages telling her that Fred Ramsdell Ramsdell, her husband, had just won the Nobel Prize for medicine. He's an immunologist. He and a couple of colleagues have been awarded this prize for their work on the human immune system. There's this fantastic sort of aspect to this story, which is that apparently Fred Ramsdell's wife had gone ahead to the car to get something. They'd kind of come down from the mountain, and he heard her scream. And his initial reaction was he thought that she'd been attacked by a grizzly bear. And then, of course, discovered that no, in fact, she was just exclaiming that her husband had just won the Nobel Prize for medicine. So, he's had a much better time switching his phone on than I usually do.
Don't go out for a night with Phil Clark unless you fancy 1,000 phone calls when you switch your phone back on again. That's the moral of the story. But congratulations to Fred Ramsdell. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Phil Clark, Professor of International Politics at SOAS University of London. Thank you so much for joining me on The Globalist. Now here's a quick look at what else we're keeping an eye on today. US National Guard troops from Texas have arrived in Chicago to support President Trump's immigration crackdown. The move has been opposed by the city's mayor, and the Illinois state governor has called it unconstitutional and an invasion. Italy's Prime Minister says she and 2 others have been referred to the International Criminal Court for alleged complicity in genocide in connection with Israel's offensive in Gaza. Giorgia Meloni said she and the Defence Minister and Foreign Minister had been denounced, along with the head of the defence group, Leonardo. She did not elaborate on who had brought the case against her. Ecuadorian President Daniel Noboa is reportedly safe after his motorcade was attacked by hundreds of people in Canny province. Reports suggest a crowd of up to 500 threw rocks at his convoy. 5 people have been detained. And Russia's President Vladimir Putin is claiming that Russian forces have captured almost 5,000 square kilometres of land in Ukraine this year. If this were correct, Russia's gains would amount to nearly 1% of Ukraine's land area. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now for a look behind the headlines, here's Monocle's Carlotta Ribello reporting from Europe's largest real estate fair in Munich.
No trade fair is the same, even if they tend to attract similar navy-suited crowds. So I was curious to stop by Expo Real in Munich this week, Europe's largest property and investment fair, to see why it remains a fixture in the diaries of developers, CEOs and city officials. Despite drones disrupting Munich's airspace over the weekend, nearly 40,000 visitors, 650 speakers, and some 1,700 exhibitors were in attendance. But this shouldn't come as a surprise. Real estate remains the world's most valuable asset class. While familiar themes of sustainability, hospitality, and housing solutions dominated discussions, a quieter, less glamorous opportunity sparked wide eyes among audiences. Logistics hubs, once a snubbed asset class, are having a moment. Last year alone, almost 1 in every 4 euros invested in property transactions here in Europe was spent on data centers, distribution points, transport hubs, and the like. So consider halting plans to renovate that warehouse into a luxury apartment complex. Perhaps it can remain a warehouse after all.
And that was Monocle's Carlotta Ribello. For more, sign up to our daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute. Just head to monocle.com/minute. This is The Globalist. Now, while Donald Trump is stealing the headlines about wanting, nay, deserving even, the Nobel Peace Prize, the committee in Norway has been busy handing out its other awards this week. Apart from the gentleman we just mentioned in the paper review, who's on a digital detox, he gets the Medicine Award. Well, the recipients of the prize for physics were announced yesterday. 3 scientists, a Brit, a Frenchman and an American, and they were awarded the prize for pioneering experiments that paved the way for the next generation of quantum technologies. Well, joining me now in the studio is Alex Wilkins, reporter on physics and technology for The New Scientist, the best man to talk us through this. Alex, good morning.
Good morning.
Remind us, what is quantum?
So quantum concerns itself with the stuff of the very, very small. It's not the kind of stuff we have around us every day, tables, chairs, cars, wherever you are right now. It's things looking at smaller than human hair, the very smallest things you can imagine, and it's where physics starts to get very strange and very bizarre.
And so strange and bizarre, but actually deserving of an award. So tell us about John Clarke, Michel Devoret and John Martinis, so the three men who've won it. What did they do?
So they were a research team at the University of California, Berkeley. John Clarke was heading up the team. He's a British physicist. He'd come over from Cambridge. He'd set up this team and they were looking at something called superconductors. Now, you probably use electronics in some form every day. These electronics all have something called resistance, which is why when you charge your laptop or your phone, it becomes very warm. That's the electrical current pushing against the wires and generating this heat. But there's a special kind of electrical conductor called a superconductor, has zero resistance, and Clarke's team were investigating the properties, the physical properties of what happens with these superconductors. They constructed a very special setup of superconductor called a Josephson junction, which you don't need to know what that means, but essentially it's two superconductors with a insulator in between. They were kind of playing around with the physics of this and seeing what happened, and they discovered that this special setup had quantum properties. This was actually very surprising to them because at the time it was thought that quantum properties were, as we said, things that associate themselves with the very, very tiny, not the macroscopic is what they call these systems, kind of large systems. So this finding that when you push current through a superconductor and it has quantum properties, this is essentially what won them the Nobel Prize. And not just finding that it had quantum properties, but allowing them to play and prod with it and see actually what does happen when we change the voltage slightly or we change the properties.
This is a lovely example of how something that happens in a very, very isolated place has enormous repercussions for everyday life.
Absolutely. So every day we use computers, phones, they're embedded in our everyday existence. And these phones have computer chips that are incredibly tiny. It's impossible to really convey just how small these chips are. And when you get to those sort of distances and scales, you have these quantum effects that Clarke and his team were investigating. So it's without their work and being able to experiment with these systems and play with these quantum systems, you just wouldn't have the kind of quantum technologies that we use every day today.
Yeah, it's absolutely lovely because John Clarke actually said it did not occur to him in any way or to the group in any way that this discovery would have any kind of significant impact. I mean, there's that sort of inherent modesty to the work that they did. Now, all this happened in 1985. What took them so long?
So it takes the Nobel Committee a long time to kind of see how discoveries play out. As you were saying, at the time, Clarke didn't know what this would be useful for, that him and his team were doing this just basically for the love and the interest of the physics, to see what happens when we play around with these systems, what can we investigate, how does the physical world work. They weren't interested at the time in seeing how this might be applied to modern technology, modern phones and quantum computers, which is something that I'm sure we'll get onto, but quantum computers as well are now kind of in their element and they're really developing at a rapid clip. But at the time, they had no idea. So I think it's taken till now for the Nobel Committee to see actually the implications of their discovery was enormous.
These men obviously had done this 40 years ago. One wonders what kind of effect being the recipient of a Nobel Prize it can be on a scientist. I mean, I would imagine that these gentlemen will probably are not going to be young anymore.
No. I mean, some of them are still practicing scientists. Two of the recipients, Michel Devoret and John Martinis, they are both working in the industry of quantum computing now. So they are kind of established scientists, but also still very active in research. You're right that this is towards the end of their career. It tends to be the case with Nobel Prizes that you do win things when you're older and kind of towards the end of your career and you've seen how your discoveries are played out. There are certain examples of physicists who've won Nobel Prizes for work when they were very young. Josephson junctions we mentioned earlier, the physicist behind that, the British physicist Brian Josephson, he did that work when he was 22 and he won the Nobel Prize not long after. So it does happen sometimes, but yes, normally it's this kind of crowning achievement. It's when you've sat back, you've looked back at your career and you get the Nobel Prize.
Alex Wilkins, reporter on physics and technology for The New Scientist. Thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to Monocle Radio. time is 8:38 in Zurich, 3:38 a.m. in Buenos Aires, and it is a little over 3 weeks before Argentinians vote in the midterm elections. Having swept to power with a chainsaw and a pledge to reform the country's finances, President Javier Milei's popularity has now taken a nosedive, and his party suffered a very bloody nose in recent elections in Buenos Aires. So, to try to win back the room, President Milei took to the stage earlier on this week, and it sounded like this. Wonderful stuff, isn't it? Now, that performance was also timed to coincide with the release of a book. And to tell us more, I'm joined now by Antonio Sampaio, expert on Latin American politics and security. Good morning, Antonio.
Good morning.
And I'm assuming that you're an expert in Argentinian rock. What was it that we just heard, please?
Well, you'll be shocked to know that I'm not an expert on Argentinian rock. And what we just heard, I think, is President Milei of Argentina doing his traditional, musical and fantastic staging of fantastic stuff. But as part of his lead up to the elections later this month, that I think deep down he must be deeply worried about, and trying to revive the energy and the charisma that got him elected in the first place, based on a lot of outsider and non-status quo sort of personality that he has.
What went wrong for him?
Basically, the economy. Argentina, as I'm sure that a lot of your listeners must know, has been struggling with budgetary, issues and debts for quite a long time. And he came to power and he got a lot of things right. He got success, especially in terms of inflation. The inflation has plummeted from double digits monthly inflation to, in June, the lowest inflation in many years. On that side, he has celebrated rightly, some successes in the economy. The problem with that is that it's based on austerity measures, and these austerity measures are taking a very, very heavy toll on Argentinians. So, for instance, unemployment has been rising. His government even celebrated publicly the fact that they fired 5,000 public sector employees. The economy has not been growing as much as he claimed that it would, because he said that by establishing fiscal discipline, the economy would grow and the Argentinians would benefit. So the benefits, the price of that budgetary discipline that he is doing is clear, but the benefits are not coming. And then last month we saw the local elections in Buenos Aires province, in which his party got severely beaten, and later this month, there is a very, very important midterm election, and investors are very worried that it signals a weakening of his mandate to pursue this fiscal discipline.
Will an appearance on stage and also the release of a book, a kind of greatest hits of what Javier Milei has said, will that actually do anything to rescue him?
Well, it might have to do. The short answer is no, but the slightly longer answer is that this stage appearance, more than a campaign speech, is probably a publicity attempt to shift the narrative a little bit from the woes of the economy and also from some corruption scandals, because his top candidate in the Buenos Aires province, precisely the province where we had the defeat last month, has been lately embroiled in a corruption scandal, the second corruption scandal of his government, in which his top candidate in the Buenos Aires province has been discovered to have had being hired by a man accused of drug trafficking, and the courts have just decided to extradite this man to the U.S. In the past few days. So, and that scandal, a man of his party, has been hitting the headlines quite heavily in recent days. So, on top of the economic woes, it's quite worrying for him.
What is likely to happen in the midterm elections across Argentina?
That is the big question, and it's clear that Javier Milei is going into this election severely weakened by the corruption scandals. The previous corruption scandal involved his sister, and who is also Karina Milei, who is also a very high-level employee and chief of staff of sorts of his government. So the corruption scandals really tarnish his image as an outsider, as someone different, and that is so he loses this scar that he has, and the economy is struggling, but not all is lost, because he has indeed achieved a great success with the reduction of inflation. The problem is that the other economic woes, such as slow economic growth, have more or less eaten that sort of growth, that success. So the performance of Milei is likely to be quite weak and quite close to the 40% mark of chairs that he must win, that analysts believe that is the mark of his success. If he gets 40% of the votes in the election, it's a safe passage for him. It's more or less of success for him, but it's looking like he's going to fall short of that.
Antonio Zampao, expert on Latin American politics and security. Thank you for joining us on The Globalist. You're listening to Monocle Radio.
IQ, EQ, and AI. 3 components key to the craft of innovation at UBS. Because to stay ahead in a rapidly evolving age, you need a partner with decades of experience, endless passion for the work, and a finger on the pulse of leading technologies, bridging human expertise with artificial intelligence, all to elevate you. UBS. Banking is our craft.
7:45 here in London. Time for a roundup of tech news. I'm joined in the studio by Isabel Hamilton, UK tech editor at Politico. Good morning, Isabel. Good morning. And we've already mentioned our newspaper guest who came in. Phil came in with no newspapers, but notes on a piece of paper. You are the tech reporter. You've come in again with no tech. You've come in with a notebook. I'm delighted by all this. You've actually got a proper notebook with proper notes in it.
Well, define proper, but yes.
Yeah, pretty good. It's got a flappy thing. It's wonderful. Yeah. Tell us what's in it.
Well, the first thing I wanted to talk about is the sort of biggest tech news of the week, which is OpenAI's deal with chipmaker AMD. I don't know if you've been watching this story, but they've signed this deal which allows OpenAI to take up to a 10% stake in AMD over time. But the way that they do that is by buying lots and lots of AMD's chips, and there's not an official number on it, but it's in the multiple billions. I think they've agreed to buy something like 6 gigawatts from AMD, and OpenAI's own executives estimate that to bring 1 gigawatt online and set up these chips in a way that is useful for OpenAI to train their AI, that costs about $50 billion. Not all of that goes to AMD. Some of that goes towards building the place where you put the chips. But, it's an absolutely massive amount of money.
Rewind a tiny bit for us. What do AMD do? And what does this deal with OpenAI and AMD mean for how things work?
So AMD make GPUs. GPUs are very, very high power, complex computer processors, and they are what AI needs to be able to run, both to be able to train it, to be able to make it in the first place, and also when you put something into ChatGPT, somewhere there is a GPU processing that request and, furnishing you with the answer. And this big deal is not the first one that OpenAI has struck with, a supplier that makes this hardware. They've also got a massive deal with NVIDIA, where NVIDIA promised to invest in OpenAI if OpenAI buys NVIDIA GPUs. So there's this incredibly circular economy that's evolving out of this AI boom, and it's causing some people quite a lot of concern. These are really big numbers. They're not all completely material yet. They're all quite contingent on the idea that OpenAI can build the infrastructure required, or find people to build it for them, and that's not a guarantee. But it's quite extraordinary, the sort of numbers that are going into this, and especially when you look at the fact that NVIDIA in particular, which is the other big chip maker, a rival of AMD, that also has a deal with OpenAI, their market valuation has skyrocketed. And there's an argument, I think a Deutsche Bank analyst put out, that really all of that sort of meteoric growth is what's keeping the US economy out of a recession at the moment. There's quite a lot riding on these deals actually materialising.
Let's move on to, thank you for that. Let's move on to an article in The Guardian about Discord. Now, that's a video game chat app, isn't it?
It is,
which has sort of questions over it. It has adult content as well. It's quite a sort of specialised, specific place to find yourself. It's had a leak.
Yeah, so Discord, it was originally just for video games. It has gone a bit broader. I'm on a Discord with some friends. It's sort of like if any of your listeners have used Slack, imagine that, but for your mates. And there's been this breach, so here in the UK, ever since the summer, there's been this law in place for places, including Discord, that might have adult content or content that could be harmful to kids, and pornography is one example, extreme violence could be another, where they have to put in effective age gating. And it was quite an uncomfortable moment in the UK where people suddenly found themselves running into something going, prove your age, not just tick you're over 18, but send a photo of your face, send your driver's licence. And one of the big worries was, if these companies have like a kind of trove of this data, what if hackers get their hands on it? And that's exactly what's happened. So it's only a small number of government-issued IDs that have been, breached, according to Discord, and it's happened via a third party because, like many companies, they brought in a third-party company to deal with this compliance, to deal with, how do we verify that someone actually is the age they are? And yeah, passports and driver's licenses are part of this leak, only a small number. But, how would you feel if you'd given a company a copy of your passport to say, yes, I am over 18, and they get in touch saying, sorry, someone's got their hands on it?
And once that goes, anybody can do anything with it, can't they?
Well, I suppose it sort of depends. It's a copy of it, but, it's very sensitive information. Your passport number, your driver's license, all these things that even just a picture of your face, like biometric information, it is quite sensitive. You don't necessarily want just anyone getting their hands on it.
Let's talk about Jaguar Land Rover. It was hit by a cyber attack. I was astonished to find this. It was August the 31st when this thing happened. And we are now, October the 8th, and they've only just started production again. This was huge.
Yeah, I think today is like this sort of staggered coming back to work that they're doing. And this is not just the UK, it's actually all over the world. I think they've got a plant in Slovakia where the same thing is happening. And yeah, this cyber attack, which, like you said, it was over a month ago now, just completely stopped everything in its tracks. And sort of like the Discord story, there's a sort of outsourcing story here. JLR is owned by Tata Group, which is a big business conglomerate in India, and they've got a consulting business that took over all of the IT for Jaguar Land Rover, and they think that the hack happened there. And it's quite, it's quite a sensitive sort of story in a way. We're not quite sure what the hackers were after. There's not that much reporting on, whether this was a ransomware attack, whether it was just intended to gum things up. But it's had a huge impact. Here in the UK, people have been out of work. I was reading in The Guardian, some smaller suppliers, which, were completely left in limbo, they had banks asking if they could put up their own houses to sort of as collateral to see them through. It's been quite an extraordinary sort of example of how a cyber attack can really take out a swathe of the economy.
We have a tiny bit of time, but in that time, the question has to be asked is that why is it that companies do not build cybersecurity protection into the software when they buy it, when they get it, that they have to outsource stuff and outsource protection?
Well, in a way, outsourcing can be quite a sensible idea, rather than trying to build something in-house and, build your own cybersecurity operation. Why not go to a company that's much more experienced, that might have encountered these groups before? But, the trouble with outsourcing is always that there's a sort of drive towards saving some money, and that's not necessarily what you want when you want a really ironclad cybersecurity operation.
Isabel Hamilton, UK tech editor at Politico. Thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, this year marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Japan, and across the country, a number of exhibitions are examining the legacy of the war and how it continues to shape Japan today. At the Takashimaya Archives Tokyo, the exhibition Black Markets and the Reimagining of Tokyo examines how the countless black markets that emerged in the aftermath of the war helped to shape Tokyo's present-day urban landscape. Well, to find out more, Monocle's Ryuma Takahashi heard from the researcher of urban history and black markets who curated the exhibition.
High-rise buildings, modern design, new technology. These don't tell the full story of Tokyo, a city in constant motion. Take Shinjuku Station, the busiest train station in the world. Just around it, there are also areas of narrow streets packed with the tiny bars. That mix of chaos and the unique character of each neighborhood is also an important part of Tokyo. Many of these unique spaces that give Tokyo its character started as black markets that appeared all over the city after World War II. So how did these black markets shape the Tokyo we see today? I spoke with Masakazu Ishigure, an associate professor of architecture at Kansai University, who curated this exhibition.
From the 1960s on, the western stations of Tokyo, Shibuya, Shinjuku, Ikebukuro, became symbols of this fast-changing metropolis. When Tokyo became a burned field after the war and started to rebuild, these stations became transfer points to the suburbs. Huge crowds came through, and with those crowds came huge black markets around the stations. I thought it would be interesting to look at how these black markets formed, how they were redeveloped, and how they shaped modern Tokyo. That's what started this research.
Japanese black markets were places where people openly did illegal trading to get goods that were hard to find during after the war, when the government controlled the economy. According to Ishigure, you can still find traces of them, even in Tokyo today.
After the war, an unbelievable number of people suddenly showed up in certain places and started selling things. Based on how these places looked before the war, you would never expect that. That's what the black market was. When these areas were redeveloped, the black market sellers usually didn't have any rights to the land, but the right of possession was recognized to some degree, and they were moved together to other locations. That's how the black markets were built back into the city. For example, Omoide Yokosho in Shinjuku started as a black market, and it's still there today, looking pretty much the same. You've got tiny drinking alleys, underground shops, stuff that wouldn't be in a planned city, all crammed around the station. That's Tokyo.
Though the post-war black markets were technically illegal occupation, Ishigure positioned them as also something that enhanced city's metabolism.
The fact that Shinjuku embraces such diversity, that very chaos, I think largely defines the character of the neighborhood. Normally, if you just have major landowners and large tenants in the city, redevelopment becomes easier. If you're purely pursuing real estate profit, you might view black markets negatively, as obstacles to redevelopment. But on the other hand, Tokyo's character as a city, its richness, its appeal, this wouldn't have emerged without the urban landscape, created by accommodating a massive number of small players and somehow coordinating them to build what we have today. The fact that these small fragments still exist today is something we should value.
The distinctive urban structure born from these black markets offers many lessons for contemporary urban planning.
Since the bubble economy in Japan, the emphasis has been on how to maximize floor space for high-profit residents and how to quickly recover your investment in the short term. But there's another approach to urban planning, one that doesn't focus on short-term profit, but rather pursues the value of the area beyond the property, the richness of living there. As an area's value increases, its commercial potential grows as well. So while it may take more time, it ultimately becomes profitable for development companies. Can we create experimental spaces within redevelopment projects, black market-like spaces where interesting players can move in low rents. As this exhibition demonstrates, the people who started in black markets brought their own stands to the street and laid out their goods. I feel like those people had a closer relationship between the city of Tokyo and their own lives.
For Monocle in Tokyo, I'm Ryuma Takahashi.
Thank you, Ryuma, for that. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers, Anita Ryota, Chris Chermak, Monica Lillis and Ryuma Takahashi in Tokyo. Our researcher was Joanna Moser and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield, with editing assistance from Hunter Wang. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. Hope you can join me for that if you can. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.
With UBS, you have a truly global partner, incorporating new technologies, innovative approaches, and unexpected opportunities, leading you to insights that help answer the questions that matter, delivered with passion, care, and unmatched expertise. Because it's about rising with the dawn each day, knowing that we can do even better. That's what banking is to us. Not just work, but a craft. UBS. Advice is our craft.